welcome back to the deep dive. You know, the source material you sent us for today feels like a study in contrasts.
How so?
Well, on one hand, we're zooming way in, looking at these microscopic rules of human behavior inside, say, a small company.
Right. How to motivate someone, how groups handle conflict.
Exactly. And then on the other hand, we immediately zoom way out to this huge macroscopic challenge of trying to capture the opinion of an entire nation with polls and surveys. The shift in scale is it's massive.
It is, but that's what makes this so interesting, right? We've got the material covering the really foundational theories of organizational behavior.
Motivation, group dynamics,
Yeah, all of that. But it's right alongside the leading edge survey methods that were developed during this huge recent crises, specifically the 2020 election and the COVID-19 pandemic.
So I guess our mission here is to pull out the core insights about how we even measure human actions, whether that's an employee's performance or a voter's preference. We need to figure out what drives the action and then how accurately we can even record it after it happens.
Exactly. We're really connecting two big questions. First, what makes people tick internally? And second, how does the way we ask about it, externally fundamentally change the answer we get?
Okay, and that's where it gets really interesting. Let's start with those internal drivers, the stuff happening inside the workplace that shapes everything. To really get performance, we have to start with motivation. You had us look past Maslow at something called Alderfer's ERG theory. What was the main problem with Maslow that ERG was trying to fix?
Well, the biggest knock on Maslow is really just how rigid his hierarchy was.
Right, the pyramid.
The pyramid, exactly. You had to satisfy the lower needs before the higher ones even became a factor. Alderfer's ERG theory is, it's a lot more flexible. It simplifies the needs into 3 buckets, but it lets you move between them. They can even be active at the same time.
Okay, let's unpack this. What are those 3 needs?
So first up, we have existence needs. These are the basics, the material and physiological things. Your salary, good working conditions, benefits, all that stuff.
The foundation.
The foundation. Then comes relatedness needs. This is the drive to build and maintain, real interpersonal relationships. Feeling connected to your coworkers, your boss, feeling like you belong.
I see that shift from just material survival to social survival. So what's the highest level?
That would be growth needs. This is the intrinsic stuff, that deep internal need to be creative, to be productive, to feel like you're making a meaningful contribution.
Personal development.
Personal development, maximizing your potential. And unlike Maslow, Alderfer has this frustration regression principle. If you're blocked from achieving growth, you might just double down on your relatedness needs instead. That flexibility is just critical for managing a modern workforce.
And that desire for growth, for contribution, that leads us right into how you actually design a job. The job characteristics model, the JCM, it's almost like a recipe for managers on how to build a job that satisfies those needs.
It is. The JCM is great because it shows which job traits lead to which psychological states. And it's those states that really unlock motivation.
Okay, give me an example.
Sure. So you take 3 job characteristics: skill variety, task identity, and task significance. And that combination creates the psychological state of experience and meaning.
You feel like what you do actually matters.
Precisely. That your job is a whole important piece of the puzzle, not just some tiny repetitive cog in a machine.
That's powerful. What are the other key psychological states?
Well, we need a sense of control and knowledge. So autonomy in the job, the freedom to schedule your work, decide how to do things, that leads to experience responsibility for outcomes.
You feel ownership.
You feel ownership for both the wins and the losses. And the final state is about knowing if you actually succeeded.
Okay, so how do you get that?
Through feedback from the job itself. Not necessarily your manager, but the work telling you how you did. That leads to knowledge of the actual results. If you can achieve all 3 of those states, that's when you get high internal motivation and real job satisfaction.
That makes perfect sense, but we know motivation isn't the whole story. It has to be paired with a sense of fairness, otherwise the whole thing just falls apart.
And that's where the Porter and Lawler model comes in, because it brings in equity theory. Satisfaction, according to them, happens after you get rewards for your performance.
Okay.
But, and this is the big catch, your satisfaction is totally proportional to how big you believe the rewards are, especially when you compare them to what you think your peers are getting. If that feels unfair, no amount of success will make you satisfied.
So, if it's all based on perceived fairness, how does a manager deal with an employee who's just wrong about how hard their peers are working. I mean, that feels like you're fighting a losing battle against bias.
It just shows how absolutely critical transparent communication is. Because if managers are always taking credit for wins or, blaming their team for failures, you get something way worse than low satisfaction.
What's that?
It's called organizational-induced learned helplessness. If your employees start to expect that their effort will fail or that it just won't be rewarded, they stop trying. The system itself kills any incentive to get better.
Learned helplessness. Wow, that sounds devastating. So speaking of organizational health, let's talk about the kind of leadership you need to navigate all this, especially in a crisis. The sources mention two main styles.
Yes, they draw a line between transactional leadership and transformational leadership, but they're also clear that the best leaders blend the two.
Okay, so what's transactional?
Transactional is all about efficiency, task accomplishment, setting clear goals, and rewarding performance based on those goals. It's the exchange, the deal.
And transformational is the bigger picture.
Exactly. It's focused on influence, on managing big institutional changes, building a shared vision that gets everyone excited. It's about inspiring the team to buy into something bigger than just their to-do list.
And in a crisis, you need both.
You absolutely need both. You need someone who can reward the immediate tasks to keep things moving, but also paint that picture of where you're all going in the long run.
And when those motivations or those visions clash, well, that's when you get conflict. The sources gave us a really clean framework for this, the Thomas and Kilman taxonomy.
It's so useful because it maps out conflict strategies based on two things. Assertiveness, how much you try to get what you want, versus cooperativeness, how much you try to help the other person get what they want.
And that matrix gives us 5 different styles.
Right. High assertiveness, low cooperativeness. You're competing.
Okay.
Low on both, that's avoiding. High on both, where you're trying to find a win-win, that's collaborating.
What are the others?
If you give up your own needs for the other person, that's accommodating. And right in the middle, splitting the difference, that's compromise. Just knowing your own default style.
So moving from conflict to consensus, the last internal piece is making sure that when groups do make decisions, they're actually high-quality decisions, not just
mediocrity by committee.
Yeah.
For high-quality decisions, you need two things, and they're non-negotiable. First is diversity.
different experiences, different skills.
All of it. Because groups that are too similar, they tend to have the same blind spots. And second, maybe even more important, is psychological safety. People have to feel completely safe to speak up, to disagree, to throw out a crazy idea.
Because if that safety isn't there, you just get groupthink. You get conformity.
You do, and we have that classic experiment from the 1930s that shows just how deep that urge to conform runs.
Sharif's experiment.
Sharif's 1936 experiment, yeah. It used the autokinetic effect, where a tiny stationary dot of light in a totally dark room looks like it's moving. When people were asked to guess how far it moved, alone they gave different answers. But in a group, they quickly changed their answers to match the group consensus. And the scary part is, they weren't just saying it. Their brains actually started seeing the movement differently to conform.
That is unnerving. It really shows how deeply wired we are to go along with the group.
And that underlying human complexity, that urge to conform, the fear of being judged, that is exactly why measuring the external world is such a monumental challenge.
Right. When we go from the small office team to trying to survey an entire country, the problems just multiply.
They really do.
So now we pivot from the cubicle to the census.
Okay, let's unpack this. The very first problem is just getting people to even answer the survey. Non-response is a huge issue.
Non-response is the silent killer of good data. And the sources confirm it's a problem that's getting worse, mostly because people are so concerned about privacy and confidentiality, especially if they think it's a government survey.
So researchers have to become, behavioral scientists just to get people to open an envelope? Pretty much. That's why you see these really elaborate experiments with different survey modes, like the Nebraska Annual Social Indicators Survey.
They tested everything, didn't they?
Everything. Web only, mail only, sending both at the same time, or that web push method where they mail you a letter telling you to go to a website.
And that connects to the qualitative stuff where they actually talk to non-respondents.
Yes, the ethnographic research. They're doing these deep interviews, not about the survey questions, but about the process. Literally watching how people sort their mail, what visual cues on an envelope make them decide to open it versus, tossing it in the recycling.
Wow. It's micropsychology for junk mail.
Basically, yeah. Yeah.
And those tiny details matter just as much in how you design the questions themselves. I'm thinking something that seems simple, like a self-rated mental health item.
With the options like excellent, very good, good, fair, and poor.
Right, it seems obvious, but is it?
Well, no. Just like with self-rated health, we need constant research to make sure those specific words, those labels, are still valid. The meaning of good versus very good can shift depending on culture or recent events. The way we ask really does determine the answer we get.
And we saw a perfect example of this with the study on abortion attitudes and how just the number of choices you give someone changes everything.
Oh, that was a fantastic experiment. They compared a simple yes-no, an agree-disagree, a 4-point scale, and a 6-point scale. And the conclusion was just crystal clear.
Which was?
Adding points to the rating scale reveals much greater complexity in how people actually feel. A simple yes-no just erases all the nuance, all the people who have conditional or, it depends kind of views. The scale forces them into a box.
That brings up a really technical but important point about unipolar versus bipolar scales.
Yeah.
How do those formats affect the results?
So a unipolar scale measures intensity from 0 up. Think not at all satisfied to extremely satisfied. A bipolar scale measures along two opposing sides, so it usually runs from a negative number through a neutral 0 to a positive number, like -2 to +2.
And what did the research find? Which one is better?
For most topics, the unipolar scales, especially when all the points are fully labeled, tend to have higher validity. But, and this is a key exception, the sources found that bipolar formats might actually have higher validity for political issues.
Why is that?
The thinking is that political alignment is naturally oppositional. It benefits from having a clear negative and positive side with a true neutral point in the middle.
These technical challenges, they just exploded during the pandemic. It forced everyone to innovate on the fly.
Absolutely. The Census Bureau's Household Pulse Survey, the HPS, is the prime example. It was designed to measure the social and economic fallout in near real time. They went from an idea to being in the field in about a month.
Wow. And they couldn't do their normal testing, right?
Yeah.
The in-person interviews.
Right. Traditional cognitive interviewing, where you sit down and ask someone why they answered a certain way, was impossible. So they pivoted to web probing.
Which means they just asked those follow-up questions right there in the online survey.
Exactly. It became an immediate digital audit of the question itself. And the benefits were huge. Way bigger sample sizes, more geographic diversity, faster data collection, and it was so much cheaper. They basically traded the deep insight of one interview for the speed and scale of thousands.
And even in the rare cases where live interviewers were still used, we got data on their technique. I was fascinated by that finding on interviewer speed.
It's a great little study. The preliminary data showed that when interviewers asked questions more quickly, they got fewer unquotable responses, which sounds good, right? More efficient.
But
But at the same time, they got a lot more requests for clarification from their respondents. So that speed was probably coming at the cost of comprehension. It's that classic trade-off between pace and understanding.
so let's connect all these technical problems back to the big one, the 2020 election. What did the sources say about why the polling was so off?
The consensus pretty much confirms that the 2020 polls systematically underestimated Republican support, just like what happened in 2016.
And the culprits, what we've been talking about.
Yep, deeply rooted technical issues. Inaccurate projections of who would actually turn out to vote, which is a coverage error, and non-response error. The fact that the kind of person who answers a poll is just different from the kind of person who doesn't.
Was there any hint on how to fix that political non-response?
A little bit. One study looked at an online panel and found that while there wasn't a huge overall difference in response rates by party, there was a little nuance.
Okay.
They found that shorter field periods, when a survey closes really quickly, were slightly more likely to have lower cooperation from Republican panelists. So it suggests that just leaving the survey open for longer might help reduce that specific error a bit.
One last thing on 2020. When people thought back on the candidates, their memories were very lopsided.
Very. Recalled information about Donald Trump was almost exclusively focused on one single thing: his handling of the coronavirus pandemic. That was it. That was the whole story.
And for Biden?
For Joe Biden, the information people recalled was much more consistent week to week, spread across a bunch of different issues. The crisis just completely focused the public's perception of one candidate, while the other's image was much more diffuse. So we've seen how tough it is to measure human behavior because of all these biases and design issues. But, and this is the hopeful part, When you do get accurate measurement, it can be powerful enough to transform policy and even save lives.
And we have a perfect concrete example of this with the opioid crisis.
Exactly. This shows the immediate, practical power of good data. The Michigan Opioid Prescribing Engagement Network developed these really strong, evidence-based guidelines for doctors.
And what was the result?
The result was that across 9 common surgical procedures, doctors prescribed 8 fewer pills per patient. The average prescription dropped from 26 pills to just 18.
That is incredible. A clear, measurable change in behavior, driven entirely by collecting better data and turning it into a simple, actionable guideline.
It proves that all this effort fighting non-response, arguing about scales, studying biases, is absolutely worth it.
It moves measurement from just an academic exercise to a public health tool.
It's a public health necessity.
A powerful way to wrap up the core of our dive. #outro. So we've really tracked the human experience today from 2 different angles. We started with the internal dynamics of motivation and conflict in a group, and we ended with the external challenge of getting precise measurements of an entire population during a crisis.
And the lesson that keeps coming up is just how critical the design of the interaction is. Whether you're in a team meeting or you're running a national poll, the outcome depends entirely on how the questions are asked, how the responses are structured, and how they're interpreted in the end.
Because you always have to account for the human element.
You always have to remember that human behavior is just full of bias and variance. From the employee feeling that learned helplessness to the citizen who won't answer a survey because they're worried about privacy.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you. If we know that something as simple as changing the type of rating scale can alter a person's recorded opinion on a huge political issue, and we know that our own motivation at work is based on how we perceive fairness, what does that imply about the stability of your own strongly held beliefs? How much of your objective opinion is really just a function of the measurement structure you're using to think about it or express it? Something to chew on as you